Roger Shamel, MBA class of 1974, who is here with us today, Jennifer Nash, Marina Jovic from the Business and Environment Initiative, and our panelists, Dr. Rebecca Henderson, Dr. John Macomber, Jim Matheson, and Smriti Mishra. Thank you guys so much for your participation. Also like to thank Felix Kramer, who initiated the Climate.MBA Challenge, and finally a few offices and clubs around Harvard that helped get the word out on today's event: the Harvard University Center for the Environment, the Harvard Council of Student Sustainability Leaders, the Office of Sustainability, the Energy and Environment Club, Food, Beverage, and Agribusiness Club, the Social Enterprise Club, and finally the Impact Investing Club. So thank you all. The Climate.MBA movement asks the US MBA community to come together and discuss the implications of climate change for business and the responsibility we as leaders in business and society have in addressing climate change. Given our regulatory environment, it is becoming increasingly clear that the private sector must rise up and lead the way on climate action. Today, we will discuss the latest view from academia and industry, and we hope to inspire many of the alumni and students who are here with us today to explore ways in which you can make a difference in climate change, both personally and professionally. We'll have about 30 minutes of discussion before opening it up for Q&A, and I'd like Rebecca to start us off on this first question. Climate.MBA was inspired by Felix Kramer. In his December 9th Mercury News op-ed, Felix noted that last February, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, the world's biggest investor, sent an unprecedented letter trying to get leaders focused on the long term, including climate change, to all S&P 500 CEOs and top foreign investors. Last January, Doug McMillon, Walmart CEO, delivered a similar message to the World Economic Forum. What is prompting these leaders to speak out? And are boards or consumers the agents of change?
That's a great question. Let me give a preliminary answer and then we'll go to the rest of the panel. So I think the first and most important thing to be aware of, and I suspect that if you're in this room or watching, you probably know this, but we need to keep saying it, is that climate change is real. It is happening in many ways at rates faster than we expected, and it will have enormous negative effects on our economy and on our society. It's important to keep saying this when the current administration has taken down a number of pages from the federal websites, but the science is still out there. And it's also important to remember that the US Republican Party is the only major party in the world to hold this particular position. And that belief that climate change was important and worth responding to used to be a bipartisan position, and certainly remains so in places like Europe or Latin America and China, where senior business leaders and senior politicians are deeply concerned about the impact of climate change. It's also the case that as we've learned more over the last few years, we've learned that burning fossil fuels arguably has as much, if not more, impact on human health as it does on increasing the risk of climate change. And so that it's not just that we should decarbonize the world's energy system to respond to climate change, but that we would have an enormous effect on human health. A couple of my colleagues at the School of Public Health use language like, stopping the burning of fossil fuels would be roughly equivalent to curing cancer. It would give everyone in the US an extra 2 years of life expectancy, and in developing nations, these numbers are much bigger. The new social cost of fossil fuel burning suggests that health costs are at least as large as climate costs, and maybe more. So, the very strong imperative to respond to this, and business leaders as major players in our society are naturally responding. But of course, business is business, so why in particular are business responding? And you asked me, is it boards or consumers? I don't think it's mostly boards or mostly consumers, except in a few industries. It's because climate change is going to hit their industries and hit it hard. And so they need to respond. This is most obviously so in agriculture, in the food industry, in energy, in IT, and of course in skiing. Which is huge, right? The ski resorts are like, whoa, heart of the business. But if you're Cargill, if you're a major food trader, then you can see what climate change is going to do to your business. And of course, the forward-looking energy companies can see that there's going to be a major transition in the energy system. I was for many years the Eastman Kodak professor at MIT. And that's what I did. I studied firms who had trouble understanding the world was changing. And I've come to start talking about this moment we face as another Kodak moment. And I think some of the fossil fuel companies don't realize that things are really going to shift. And we've got the classic, it's not happening, it won't work, no one will pay for it, and I can't get it done. And that perspective is manifestly false in many industries. So there's a range of business cases that will allow business to move forward against climate change. And last but not least, you're beginning to see some interesting rumbling about collective action, right? So we can all give the great stories like Walmart is saving $1 billion a year by thinking carefully about optimizing energy use in their transportation network, and that the introduction of LED bulbs was a multi-million-dollar opportunity for them. And to quote the CEO, you couldn't get sustainability out of this company if you tried. And that's arguably one of the most operationally efficient and most cost and profit oriented companies in the world. So they're all over this because it's lots and lots of money. But of course it doesn't get you all the way. If we're going to decarbonize the whole grid, we're going to run out of immediately profitable opportunities until and unless we have a regulatory environment that will really take us that last few miles. Although, I hope I'm not like saying everything and leaving you guys with that.
You're good, we're just going to listen.
Is it okay so far?
Beautiful.
Because I can't help noticing that the costs of renewables have fallen much faster than anyone expected. I have a lovely paper called The Unexpectedly Long Old Age of Optical Photolithography, which I wrote, so I guess I shouldn't describe it as lovely. But what we know is we're really bad about predicting rates of technical change in advance, but that when you start putting serious money and energy against it, I mean, prices go like this. And we know that solar is now cost competitive, barring the problem of storage, but in several regions of the world, solar contracts are now quoting without subsidies at lower rates than the competition. That's incredible. No one expected that 7 years ago. But so there's a lot going on. But collective action. 2 thoughts on collective action. 1, is the finance sector going to be really, really important? So this idea is courtesy of my colleague George Seraphim, who spends a lot of time with the big investors, thinking about what are the implications for things like climate change and water stress and the other major sustainability issues we face for the large financial players. And the reason finance is interesting is A, because everybody needs it, B, because the large financial players have to pretty much hold the market. If you're the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, or if you're the California Pension Fund, you have to hold the market. You cannot diversify away from carbon risk. And more financial players are seeing that there's a very significant risk of not responding to the threat of climate change, and that it's very possible we're in the midst of a carbon bubble, and then when people realize that, very interesting things are going to happen to the stock prices of a number of firms. So there's very deep interest in finance, and what's interesting about that as collective action is that it's a smaller group of people to get to say, okay, let's act together, we want to see output, we want to see your greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to invest in you in line with how you're responding to these major challenges. That's one big thought. Last and final thought, some business leaders are stepping forward to say, as a business collective, we need a carbon price. A carbon price of some kind, a tax or cap and trade, remains the most cost-effective and most efficient way of transitioning our economy. Many business people realize that, and they'd rather have that certainty and that efficiency than hodgepodge local regulations that are inefficient and costly. So there's hope for collective action at the global level in the business community for very good business reasons.
Thanks so much. Following up on that, what kind of roles should students pursue if they hope to one day lead organizations in this battle against climate change? And in your opinion, which industries offer the most opportunity? You mentioned agriculture. Where else do you think MBAs from Harvard and other business schools can really make an impact?
Do you want to answer or do you want me to?
No, I think it's your turn.
Okay. So I'll give a much more tactical answer. And partly I'll build off what Rebecca said about finance. So what she quoted from George Serafim is around finance as portfolio management and risk management and diversification. You can also look at finance as project finance, as seeking operating yield. And one of the great paradoxes in the world is there's so much capital in the world looking for yield. There's 30 or 40 trillion dollars with a T of fixed asset investing, most of which is earning 0% to 2%. At the same time, there's this huge need for the kind of infrastructure that would mitigate or help to mitigate a lot of the climate things that we talk about. So the paradox is, how can you bring all that capital to bear for the need? So a lot of what I look at is the things that students can do around these three huge trends of our times. One is massive urbanization, as hundreds of millions of people move to cities. The second is bad and worsening resource scarcity. These are all ideas I got from you, Jim, so I hope you got new things to say. As there's not enough clean air, not enough clean water, not enough food, not enough land, too much garbage, too much traffic. And in the perfect world, governments would plan ahead using well-financed projects based on evidence, based on consensus, and build out the infrastructure that we need for cleaner water, clean air, all that. I don't know if you follow politics that much. I'm not sure we're going to get to political consensus anytime soon. So what can the private sector do? What can students from here imagine doing that moves hundreds of millions of dollars into some of these areas? And there's a lot that can be done around the participation in private finance of roads, bridges, water, power, and transit, where you can imagine a cash flowing, positive yielding project that's bankable, where the risk is mitigated to address transportation either in the developed world or in the emerging world also. So part of what I encourage students to do is think about the kind of people who are investing in project finance in $10 and $100 million chunks, of which there's a lot, and the kind of companies that do that, which tend to be multinationals. So students who leave here and go to do a piece in GE Water or a piece in Tesla or a piece in turbines at Siemens or ABB wind up having a big P&L under them pretty quickly. So that's not necessarily the intuitive thing, but that's a piece of the tactics. And it's also something I've found, being in the finance unit, you can do without ever talking about carbon. So I'm busy thinking about how can I support what Rebecca's talking about in a very sort of tactical, sort of blocking and tackling kind of way to address this infrastructure paradox of all this capital that can be deployed against these things that will help us use water, power, and food better than we currently do.
Just to follow up, Jim, so you were a general partner at Flagship Ventures, now the CEO of Oasys. Are you seeing a growing trend in the number of investors and deals that focus on project finance or other solutions to climate?
Sure. You're jumping right through the first two questions. There's so much meat there. I want to get back
Feel
into
free
it.
to
We'll sort of come back to it. It is good to see all the first and second year, and I think some third year MBAs in the group. So let me touch a couple of points and then come to answer your question. I'll avoid it like I did my 2 years here in the classroom. So if you look at the first question, was you got the CEO of Walmart and BlackRock sort of talking about these issues. And what that tells you is that no matter what you do when you leave HBS or whatever our graduated colleagues are doing, you can't avoid this topic, right? Whether you're in the retail business, you're trying to sell through Walmart, you're in the supply chain business of technology, you're in the investment business, you're running a big company and you have BlackRock as an investor, or any of these other folks that are really having you focus on it. There's no place that you can go and can or should avoid the topic of climate change, or as I tend to think about sustainability, which is really connected to, but to some degree maybe even broader than the issue of climate change. And so whatever you're thinking about, you're going to touch this. And if you think about this question of what MBAs should do, I tend to think more about, and I've come to this over my career, which was split really evenly at this point between a bunch of years active duty military and now a bunch of years starting, investing, and running companies in the sustainability sector, many focused on climate change issues. So for me, it's probably revisionist history, but I think about building a career in terms of sort of thematic connections. And so if you're in here because you're passionate about the environment, about climate change, about sustainability, which I think we all should and need to be, there's really an interesting career that one could stitch together, and there's no single route to get there. Just look at the number of clubs that you mentioned at the beginning that came to make this possible. That is a microcosm of the complexity of the climate change sustainability question. It requires everybody. It's not just a product service question. It's not just about innovation. It's not just about regulation. It's not about big companies, not about small companies, not about finance. It's about all of that together in a system, and it's a system that is in the midst of change. And there's a bunch of us that want to change it, and there's a lot of folks that don't want that to change, and that's Rebecca's area of expertise. So there's a lot of incumbent interest, whether it's in the energy business, transportation business, or in the government business. So you got to think about your career, I think, as a theme, and try to get those different experiences, because I think if you're really going to move the dial individually and collectively, you have to understand the system. Now, my undergrad and graduate work was in systems engineering, so I tend to think about the world through that, but it really is a system with all those dimensions. And through your career, if you can build the experiences to touch on those, and it may be towards being a great investor, maybe towards being a CEO, maybe towards being an elected or an appointed official, where you can really move the dial. But I think through your career, assembling those experiences, I think matter a lot. So now to your question of the investment environment. So when I left HBS, I joined Flagship Ventures, just getting started. Over the last 16 years, the firm has grown and been very successful, about $1.5 billion under management. In 2004, like a lot of other firms, we started looking at the area of clean tech. And as I said, I think it more in terms of sustainability, which is all about understanding resource value chains locally, regionally, globally, and what trends are happening to make those resources more scarce. Scarcity brings volatility, brings price increases, brings risk, brings opportunity. And so the lens that I've looked through this problem set at has been, how does breakthrough technology embodied in a startup company go into that sector? How do you build a company that's valuable and important? When we talk about our values at Oasys, we talk about being valuable and important. Those are different things. There's lots of valuable companies that are unimportant. There's lots of important companies that are not valuable. How do you become both valuable and important? At least that's what I'm interested in doing. I mean, that's a real challenge, because some of the business model challenges and capitalization challenges for these types of solutions, especially innovation-based solutions, are difficult. The reality of it is, if you go back to 2004 through 2010, there was this huge boom in clean tech investing. So the traditional venture capitalists got involved, thinking that Moore's Law could once again save the day in this problem. And that's part of it, but these are big systems, as I've discussed. And to move those big systems, you not only have to have a really cool innovation, but you got to figure out a path to market, you got to understand the regulatory environment, you got to get access to capital. And as we see here today in 2017, I would say that the capital value chain for innovation, or for companies that are solving this problem, is insufficient and broken. There's not enough from early innovation by the government in national labs. I'm just talking about the US, but same thing globally. There's not enough money supporting new companies, certainly not enough companies or money that's supporting growth. John mentioned it, where there is a lot of capital, interestingly, is money seeking yield. So there's all this money sitting out there, and if you can, as Rebecca indicated, bring cost of your solution, a la solar, down to a place where it can get deployed at scale, there's tons of capital. But that's a 10, maybe 20-year cycle to take a new idea, a new solar technology, and get it to the point where it's at scale. So how do we do that? How do we do these long cycle investments when, as Larry Fink points out, everybody's got short-term mindsets? So that's a real problem. And I tend to think of every problem as an opportunity. So there's a real opportunity, and my passion has been not only focusing on Oasys, but an early stage innovation, but thinking, how do we stitch together coalitions to think about stitching together the right capital value chain? And there's some good work by Raman Ananda and other folks here at HBS that are thinking all about this capital value chain, and the idea that you've got to have connection along that value chain. Because you can have a lot of early stage capital, but if there's no growth capital, you have huge capital risk, and that early stage capital goes away. If you don't have robust capital markets and investment banks and the right CEOs to get and take and run a public company, that's not going to work either. So I would say it's broken, it's a work in process, and one of the reasons that I made the choice to get out of the immediate investing business and run one of my companies was that the ecosystem was so broken, it was frustrating. I said, what I want to do is go in and move the dial for one company for a while and apply all the wisdom I thought I was applying at the board level as a CEO again, and that's been great. I expect that my next move will be back into the world of how do we move these pieces of capital and also the regulation along. There's so much more to capture there, but I'll stop.
Smriti, is there anything you wish you took advantage of while you were at HBS that would have better equipped you to deal with climate change in a business context?
There's no shortage of resources here, especially with the amount that you can cross-register around to the other schools. And I personally, I was in recap version 1, did an independent study with Professor Macomber, went down the street to MIT to take energy ventures over there. There's a lot that you can learn and take advantage of, and really spending your time dedicating to like what are the pieces you want to pull together is valuable. There's of course more that I wish I pushed on. What I'm working on right now, I think shed some light on that. So I've been at National Grid for about a year and have started working on a collaboration with Sunrun. We have a couple of different things we're doing with them, and my particular project is working together on how we would envision a business model for solar plus storage grid services. And that's bringing together a lot of these barrier questions that Jim's talking about and the infrastructure questions that John was talking about. Fundamentally, it wasn't until I came here that I started to really think about the very holistic approach for the entire sector that an entity like National Grid has to take, right? As we have a fundamental duty to our customers and communities to meet all of their energy needs and reliability needs today and tomorrow, and there's no moving on that. And we also see, considering climate issues as just as fundamental to that. In order to be there for our customers and communities tomorrow, we need to be adapting and to be understanding what has to change in the energy sector. So, coming in here, getting that holistic perspective, I would have loved at HBS to have that opportunity to better understand how public entities think about all of those components that they're bringing together. I did do a case while I was here on how RTOs and all the electric systems work together, and that was really, really valuable. The more you can step out into the world being policy literate and infrastructure literate, the better. It's a huge impact on any of the work that we do. Of course, we're dealing with questions in the federal policy land, but there's so much that's driven at the state level and on RTO tariffs and the kinds of designs that they're working on. So when we talk about, there's some conversations that were started at the federal level that we are suspecting will stop maybe in DC, but are already really pushing forwards. For example, storage integration on the grids, right? All of the ISOs have just submitted their comments for how they would consider adapting. What are all of the components that they need to consider for bringing storage onto the grid? Storage is a great piece to think about. There will definitely be opportunities in this space. It is very, very complicated. Batteries sound easy enough, and stuff that we can get our heads around. Like you've got them in your phones, you plug it in to charge it, and when you use it, it discharges. That's great. From an electric grid perspective, batteries are a little bit of generation, right? They can give you electricity when you need it. They're a little bit of transmission, right? Transmission infrastructure moves electricity from point A to point B in space. Batteries move it from point A to point B in time, right? They can serve a lot of that and be what we call non-wire solutions to transmission projects or potential projects. And their load, right? What are the times when you're having really high usage, high generation for your solar assets that needs to get used somewhere and you need a higher load? Batteries can do that too. So that they're so versatile makes it really valuable, but also hard to really integrate and have work into the system. And so the ability to be literate in that holistic approach is going to inform any part of the business that you're in. And any role that you have, whether it's within energy or, as you were talking about in supply chain or anything else, if you're operations, strategy, finance, the more you can think about those components and what to bring together, the better.
Thanks all for answering my questions. I'd love to open up the floor to hear everyone else's questions, both here in Aldrich and online. We have almost 50 participants now. So we'll start here in the room. If you have a question, please feel free to ask now, and we'll try to get any questions in online as well. If you have one, just write in the chat that you have a question to ask. Thanks. Sure.
My name's Ken Brown, HBS 76. I guess I'm a third year?
You may be a fourth year.
My company is Safe Hydrogen, and we store electricity using hydrogen from electrolysis. But going back to the question of where can students find opportunities, I would say any company that has any type of supply chain that uses trucking, rail, barge, or oceanic shipping has a stake in this climate change thing. Because all that infrastructure, the use of it is burning fossil fuel now. It's not sustainable, but there are ways we can go forward. We can save energy, improve the bottom line, and do a lot of things. So there's a lot of things. And I'll save the rest of these meaty answers to the other people.
If I can just jump in and push that a little further, just
Sure.
to say, any company that has a pricing forecast for raw materials of any kind is going to be impacted by this. You know, several of us have had this conversation of what's happening in weather and how that impacts not only your natural gas prices, what they're having when we suddenly have a warm winter, and 2 years ago had 9 feet of snow. What happens to the Northeast gas prices is crazy, and those energy inputs go into the pricing forecast of everything else. It affects your agriculture outputs. So any company that has to forecast anything should be caring about where what's getting disrupted.
Agreed.
Roger.
Thank you. Excuse me. I've got a little bit of a cold, but my name's Roger Shamel, class of '74. I want to thank David and the BEI for organizing this. I'm thrilled to see Harvard Climate Week is on the schedule for this year. That's something I think David had a lot to do with. And I'm a scientist, so I'm excited about the Science March that's taking place on Earth Day, April 22nd. Then there's a climate march in New York on the other end of Climate Week on the 29th. And as somebody that worked as a consultant for Arthur D. Little and then my own company, I came to see that climate change is the biggest threat society faces. And it is that because we've never faced it before in modern history. And it's very subtle, other than an occasional clue like the fact that it's in the 70s outside in February. Most people can go through life as if everything's fine. So my question is, as great as all this is, if you're the average American or average Harvard MBA or Harvard alum, everything seems pretty normal out there. So what can we do as business schools and alumni to ramp things up so that there's a sense of urgency that's consistent with what's going on? Because scientifically, we can reach points of no return where all the king's horses and all the king's men, so to speak, can't do anything. But the public doesn't appreciate that because it's not on the nightly news or anywhere else, and there's actually a lot of money being pumped into the system from those who benefit from the status quo to maintain the status quo. So what can we do to save ourselves and our children from where we're headed is what I would like to ask the panel.
Please.
Could I take just a quick cut at that? First, I think that is such a fabulous question, really a fabulous question, and it's complicated by the fact that we now know from people who've been studying communication around climate change that you need to communicate it in very different ways to very different people. And sometimes it's not about the scientific information at all, it's about the milieu in which the information is communicated. So it's really, really tricky. Let me highlight a couple of things that we're trying to do here at the business school, which are like small steps towards your really important goal. So this fall, for the first time, we've had cases about companies dealing with climate change in the first year for a long time. And this year, in the first year in the production management class, all the students had to read a new note that we produced called Climate Change in 2017, which is everything you wanted to know about the science and the engineering and the economics and the politics in 12 pages. But really is designed to be a basic primer for anyone who's inside a firm and wants to raise the subject of climate change, or an MBA student who hasn't run into it and wants to think about it. So the first year production course ran a week-long exercise, I believe it was a week, in which teams had to think about how they would respond to climate change in a particular business. And so we're trying to make sure that this is, like, at least in the MBA program, a well-covered base. At the broader level, I'm curious what the whole panel says. I am speaking and blogging and videos, and we're going to put recap up as an HBS X class. what are the two big problems facing the world? Well, we're burning the climate and destroying the society, but apart from that, we're in really good shape. So we're trying, but I think, we're all up for new ideas. Hughes has a new website with videos from everyone all over the campus. And there's talk about really trying to bump up that communication effort, but such a great question. John?
It's particularly difficult now when there's alternative truths. So Rebecca and I have been on a lot of panels, and President Faust will come out and say, first we have to talk about Veritas, like what's actually true. That's what we're here to do, and then we have to continue on the other issues. So it's a doubly difficult situation. So part of what we do as faculty is say, look, here's what's actually going on. Here's the facts, here's the evidence, draw your own conclusions, and then here's what we can do. As I described before, mine is very tactical. How can you imagine getting a job where you can allocate a lot of capital into doing something that makes a kind of a difference on the ground in some power plant or some road or some bridge, not so much in a
But that really
policy.
helps communicate, right? The more there's a clear business case and the more you need to think about it for business reasons, that's a much easier framing to talk about it in. This is a business risk we have to deal with.
It's an easier framing for a couple of reasons. One is that pretty much everybody can agree there's too much traffic, or they can agree on particulates. So you're not looking at a regulatory kind of response that's going to forbid something. It's really hard to make new laws to forbid stuff, or it's hard to get the government to spend a lot of money to do stuff. But you can mobilize people around, less traffic, less particulates. That makes some sense. It's not as scary. So it makes sense in that way. That's right.
So there's a lot to do, and I guess any one of us can only do what we can do, but some of the things that I've attempted to do that have been more or less successful, a lot of this is volunteer work. So I'm going to talk about, so I've committed my career to starting companies, running companies, so that's sort of the clearest manifestation of what one can do. But from that perch, you try to connect and convene the best that you can. So I was one of the founders of the New England Clean Energy Council. We then started the New England Water Innovation Network. So it was how do you, instead of one voice, how do you bring all the voices? How do you bring old and new industry together? How do you talk about these topics as opportunities rather than challenges? And how do you engage in the muck of regulatory and political discussion, which you got to do, and you got to speak the language of the other person, and that's about jobs, whether it's in the state or in the country. And right now, it's a lot about jobs. So I mean, there's a dialogue to be had about why return to coal, and rather than moving forward to solar, when so many more jobs are made available in so many more places. So you got to have those conversations. You got to write. You got to blog, and I think you got to do it. It's tough, right? Because we're here in, well, not really Cambridge, but we're really close to Cambridge. But we're in this intellectual, place, right? And we think that everybody thinks the way that we think. It's so not true. I was here. We taught the Oasys case, plus or minus the election. It was great because we spent in fact, I think it was the day after the election, and the whole student body was sort of reeling from this. Many people were. And so the discussion was, how do you have the conversation? I said, listen, in 2 weeks I'm going to go home to rural Ohio, where my wife's from and where I went to high school. And that's a very different conversation you have, not good or bad, but I think we've all got to educate ourselves to talk and make sure that the folks we're talking to can understand and talk in terms that they care about and that they can understand, whether it's about jobs or education. But I think we really got to cater our message and take the time and energy to write and to be out there, and especially you got two esteemed professors who are doing that. But wherever you are, if you get into a company, my guess is that the company you're going to end up in, whether it's investing or in clean tech or it's a big company that may be old school, there's going to be a sustainability council. There's this whole new track of chief sustainability officers, right? So it's a thing we should be doing here at Harvard is preparing our graduates to follow that track. Maybe your end game is not being CEO. It's good as others being a CEO, I can assure you. But maybe your passion is to be a CSO, right? How do we get down that path? How do you influence your organization when you get there? Sign up and volunteer for things. So it requires a lot of time and education, and I think most importantly it requires connectivity and community, because otherwise if you're doing it by yourself, it's too chaotic and you're stabbing at windmills and you get tired. And I think you've got to do it together, and don't take the windmill take it with a tank. Not whatever it was that Don Quixote had, a little sword.
And a donkey.
And, yeah, and a donkey, of course.
But you know what he was trying to get rid of? Wind power.
Wind power, exactly. Exactly. So the metaphor broke down. But he was scared of change, I think, is what the key was.
Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda, lead RC here. I think a lot of students get a lot of training to figure out how to calculate value from a financials perspective, right? How do you maximize an IRR and NPV? But when we're trying to figure out where we can add the most value or maximize value from a climate change impact perspective, how might you recommend we go about doing that?
Well, I'll take that because as I was referring to forecasting gets hard, right? So when you're looking at your IRR, like what's the year you're measuring it to, right? If you're looking at just this quarter, you're gonna have a really hard time actually making your business healthy over the long term, right? And so this is back to that long-term approach. But the business model that I'm working on right now needs to have a good IRR. It needs to be something that can support itself and be sustainable, but I've got cash flows that I'm projecting over 10, 20 years, right? And definitely there's a lot that I can't predict, and there's a lot that's speculative at that point, but you'll take your high, medium, low cases, and the uncertainty that gets baked into thinking about how the climate's going to impact your underlying drivers, the policy changes that may or may not happen that could impact underlying drivers, definitely plays out in the financials, right? Like, numbers don't come out of nowhere. And so the more you can think about like what's behind any of the numbers you're putting into a model, the climate becomes a financial decision.
Yeah, I think some of the most interesting work's being done in holistic life cycle analyses and in the impact investing world, where you take the classic P&L and you start to try to, Smriti says, how do you start to model and make assumptions about externalities, whether it's the risks of climate change or carbon pricing differences. If you're going to do an electricity plant, it's a big deal, right? You're naturally doing that, but almost every decision that we've talked about has that impact. So I think really thinking about innovation in the financial model world and how you make these assumptions, there's some really good work being done here and at other schools around that. In the impact investing world, where we've got to convince and demonstrate to investors that they don't have to take a hit in yield to do the right thing, right? So you can actually, if you make the right assumptions and you take the right business approach and choose the right solution, you can make money doing this.
And to be fair, it's not always true, right? It's not like
Sure.
it's always the economics clearly show that it's worth investing. It's like I hear what's underneath your question, which we've done the not answer it thing first. But that's where like there are more companies that are thinking about like what are the other the non-quantitative impacts of the work that we do. How does it impact our either, let's say, engagement with employees or engagement with our customers and communities, right? Those are also some somewhat tangible but qualitative metrics that people think about now. So there's a lot that you can pull together to make the case.
I thought I heard the question a little differently, and maybe you can tell us again. But I thought you said, so what should I personally do? And a couple of years ago, Rebecca and I led the Bridges, which is the end of the second year program. We drew a continuum of, well, you can chain yourself to a fence and go on a hunger strike and do all this other stuff, or you can work in a company that's engaged in some of these activities, or you can work in a bigger company and make sure the portfolio is a little bit green, or you can ignore it for later. Is that kind of what you were asking about, those range of things that
Yeah,
we
like
should individually do?
people in this room want to maximize their impact, like financial metrics aside, they say like we want to like save the world, like how's,
So
to make that decision and those trade-offs of like, should I go to Walmart and help them maximize their portfolio, or should I?
So you're here on the thing, and over here you're chaining yourself to the fence, and you're with Bill McKibben and stuff. But partly, then I would profile that by what are you good at? And what do you like to do? How much debt do you have? But if you really like to be out front and you're charismatic and don't have student debt, you could be in one place. If you're in the spot where you say, I'd really like to understand how to be one of these global capital allocators, and I'll go ahead and I'll put my head down and work at Blackstone or Carlyle or somewhere, then going to emerge and start a fund. That's a lot different. Those all can be paths where you can filter based on what you're good at, what you like to do, and what your current circumstances are. So none of those is the right spot for anybody, but I think about that continuum and the other characteristics of you.
I do think, so I will now answer the question, I guess, is there is to this question of how we make money, I do think absolutely an existential question of how we make the enterprise sustainable, right? Which means it can make money and it can attract capital, it can attract human capital, right? And there are easier, I can tell you there are a lot easier paths to make a lot of money and a lot easier paths to do different things than this. So, I mean, there's sort of that.
You're just upset you missed Snap.
No, yes. Right, but so I won't even get in,
Speaking of valuable but not important.
I won't judge that, but yes. So I just say there is that to be clear. I think that's the point you were getting at, but I do think there's a lot of intersection there, and our job is to create a bigger intersection.
I'd also put a time frame out there. If you think about activities in this space, and imagine 10 years from now, even if the weather's the same, just by force of migration, there'll be more people in the world, more people in cities, more demand on these resources. There'll also be plausible autonomous vehicles. There will also be the idea of an Uber pool kind of concept that could replace subways. There probably will be 3D printing where things in African villages could be printed instead of being made in China and shipped around. And if you try and anticipate where the world might be in a decade when you kind of emerge from, what did you call it, from this you didn't call it a portfolio, but these themes of life, and anticipate where that's going to be, you can posit some interesting things and learn about some of those technologies while you're busy doing whatever Bain has you doing, and then be able to emerge 10 years later and see what that is. So the world is, even if the weather doesn't change at all, the world is going to be a lot different than it is today. There's going to be much more pressure in all these resources, and there are going to be other ways to address it, cashless transfers that mean you don't need central banks, lots of things in that regard. I don't know if we responded to your question. We should ask if we're answering your question.
Let's just note the world will be different. Sea levels will be up considerably.
But yeah, but then it's
Okay, but I just want to go on record. We know the world is going to be different.
Thank you.
I want to get a question in from our digital audience. So
Can we
Buckley,
answer your question? We're all trying to guess what your question is.
You pummeled her, that's good.
Buckley Brickman is joining us from Wisconsin. He runs the NIST MEP Center there, and over 98% of the manufacturers in the U.S. are small and medium sized, not multinationals, to your point earlier, Jim. So what initiatives do you see focused on this section of the economy?
So could I take the first cut at that, just so the rest of the panel can correct me? My understanding is that one of the most plausible ways small and medium-sized manufacturing firms can respond to this challenge is to just look at energy efficiency. I mean, my understanding is a lot of work has been done, but because energy has been relatively cheap, many firms in fact have very high return projects, almost literally lying around on the factory floor. I mean, sort of 15-16% rates of return projects. And so there's a number of centers trying to support small firms in doing that and really going after energy efficiency as a major source of increased profitability and reduced costs. So that would be my number one.
I have to say, I actually worked at a warehouse pre-HBS, and that was huge for us, right? It was just a warehouse, but making some simple changes to schedules when we turned off the conveyors. There's just a lot of machinery, and it was a distribution facility, so it wasn't even manufacturing that had that much more equipment, but we were able to make a lot of small adjustments that didn't impact the operation at all, but were huge impacts to the general spend. So there's definitely opportunity there.
I was just going to build on what was said here about logistics and rail and freight. So people can get a point source and figure out some energy efficiency, and they control one thing. They don't necessarily control their shipping and their trucking and everything else. There's opportunities to be a coordinator of all those things and optimize, much as Enernoc did in demand response energy for you. That what you suggested about logistics and trucking for all these smaller businesses that are areas that are harder to coordinate solely. So there's a business, a little different meaning of the word collective action kind of. It's not even the right use of the word, but a coalition kind of way to take out waste and foolishness from the system that way.
You know, it's interesting, you think about small business or small to mid-sized manufacturing. To some degree, Oasys is that, right? So we're doing most of our manufacturing of our core components in the US, but we build projects in India, China, we're going to South Africa, Korea. So we have to think about not only what we do kind of locally, but the whole global piece.
What do you do?
What's that?
What does Oasys do? You didn't tell people.
We clean up the world's nastiest waters. We can talk about that later.
So as I understand it, it's a filtration business, but you started with the the beachhead is saying there's people who are doing fracking or chemical processes who will pay a lot of money to get the water cleaned up. Then maybe in the future you'll be able to move to stormwater and municipal waste and those kind of
Yeah,
things.
correct. So we've invented and commercialized a new membrane-based system. So a whole new membrane that resides in the systems. We have to manufacture all that and build multi-million-dollar projects. So we have to think of the manufacturing question, the local manufacturing question, also think about when you deploy it. I would love to talk about that. I want to go in a different direction, which is, I think if you look at the macro trends right now, national, especially in the US, I think there's a really interesting move to small and medium manufacturing, use of robotics, higher trained workforce, and I think you can also, if done correctly, and you think about the sort of the locavore food thing, I think you're gonna see a movement to some of that localized manufacturing where you can really have an impact by managing the logistics, by serving the local community or being thoughtful about manufacturing. And you kind of play into one of these trends. There's a clear trend, there's gonna be a movement to some onshore, both from a tax and a tariff trade policy, but also I think just the cost and the externalities of traditional manufacturing and the risk that some of these multinationals have. So I think if you think about trends, to me, that's what I've been paying attention to. We're living it at Oasys. I think it's a very clear trend, which is not a normal path for HBS graduates to think about. It's either starting or joining a small to medium manufacturing business, but we still got to manufacture stuff. And I think that's going to be a super interesting trend over the next decade or two.
I think we have time for one last question here, so who has the best one? We'll take you.
My name's Andy Vallander. I was in the class of 71. I just think it's great that a panel like this is focusing and encouraging the way the private sector can play such a major role in climate change. But there really are two other types of institutions that I think HBS graduates need to also think about. Jim touched on one group, the nonprofit world from the volunteer side, but the nonprofit world also can use very well-trained, business-oriented individuals to be as impactful as possible. And just to give you an example, in my post-retirement life, I've been spending my time with a local group called the Conservation Law Foundation. And the Conservation Law Foundation isn't a huge organization, 60, 70, 80 individuals. We won't go into the extra challenges of running an organization that is full of lawyers. I've got to keep away from making statements like that. But it's a organization that basically is intervening in ways where the market isn't able to deal with some of these issues. A recent lawsuit, a trendy one, was against ExxonMobil. Conservation Law Foundation is very involved in the rate setting commission in all of the New England states. Right now, there are 3 of us with Harvard Business School, 2 of them even get paid for it. Harvard Business School degrees working at CLF. Going beyond that, John knows well, in my own career, working at the Appalachian Mountain Club. Doesn't seem like that's a typical group that might be out there in the forefront, but it's a fairly big business. Won't go into the details of running overnight accommodations up in the mountains or the retail business or the book business. But what EMC was able to do was to convert people. We haven't really talked about that today. The fact that there are an awful lot of individuals in this country right now who don't, either don't care or don't believe. And EMC was able, you could get individuals to take hikes in the White Mountains and they thought that they were just going up to have a good time. If you did the right activities while they were up in a White Mountain hut or a lodge in Maine, they would listen. People would pay attention in an environment like that and come away thinking, hey, conservation is something that is important. I do need to pay attention to it. But it just gets back to, there's another nonprofit organization that needs good, trained individuals that have backgrounds like all of you. So please don't forget the nonprofit sector. And I won't belabor this by saying that, and I don't want this to undermine my credibility, but the government sector. I'm not sure I'd recommend any of you do what I did. The first job I had out of HBS was working in Washington. Didn't have quite as much debt to worry about way back then. But, those guys have a huge influence. And so sometime in your careers, whether it's right out of school or maybe it makes much more sense mid-career or toward the end, think about the government sector, because boy, those guys make a difference.
Can I say thank you for that. And if I was on the CLF Ventures board for a number of years, so even if you're not going to go in, you can find a role either on a nonprofit board. I've done a lot of advisory work for DOE and Department of Agriculture. So there's ways, if you can't go all the way in now, get connected and start building that network and understand what's going on, so later in your life you can enter in a more senior place. I think that's a fabulous comment. There's ways to do it in many different roles.
And he sort of downplayed his own experience taking the Appalachian Mountain Club from a sleepy organization that happened to have 50 or 60,000 passionate members, professionalizing it, making it much larger, building alliances with about 200 different environment and forest preservation and dam groups across New England, and making it a real powerful voice for environmental advocacy from an experiential point of view with respect to recreation and conservation and education, using his Harvard MBA to be deployed that way.
But I was only able to do it because, as Jim was suggesting, I got excellent board members like John Macomber to work with.
So yesterday, we had an event here on campus called Lectures That Last, where faculty from each Harvard school spoke and treated the topic as if it were the last lecture that they were delivering. And we had the pleasure of Professor Henderson delivering her remarks. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I don't think we have quite enough time for a lecture that will last. But if you could leave us with a thought that would last in a minute or two, just each of you go through and, what words do you really want us all to remember when we leave here today?
Someone else want to go first?
I just think, I think I spent the first part of my life in military service. I think I really do look at what I do now similarly so, which is you're serving, and try to find a place in the world where you can make a difference. And that takes coming out of here to go down some of these paths. It takes independent thinking, creativity, courage, and community to make all that happen. And it's a lifetime avocation, because this is, if we're lucky, we'll make a difference in our lifetime. If we don't do anything, we're certainly going to feel the pain. This is going to take all of us and many, many more for the rest of our lives to continue to drive the world in the right direction.
I'll build off of that to say, especially to the students, but even to the alumni on the webinar, is just don't give up, right? It's very easy, actually. I've had plenty of opportunities to do other work and pulled in different directions. But one of the biggest luxuries that we have coming from here is the ability to make a lot of choices about what we want and where we want to make a difference. So don't forget that, and when it feels really, really hard, know that you need to push just a little bit more. Coming out of HBS, I had my first offer rescinded. I had to do multiple job hunts, and I'm really glad that I pushed through it. My first offer was with a startup that didn't close funding. Like, it's the kind of risk that any number of people will end up facing, right? But I went in knowing that was the risk I was taking. I'm still glad that I went down that route. I learned a lot through that process, and I'm happy with what I've learned and I ended up going through over the years. So I know it can be really hard, but push through. And that doesn't mean even if you're not in energy, remember the issues that we're talking about. When that holistic approach is hard to be the voice in the room that's reminding people of it, just keep being that person, because you have the credibility, you have the ability to make a difference. So that's just my strong reminder to everyone in the room, is to stick with it.
Leave the last word to Rebecca. I would just channel what my father would say to me every time I had a career choice to make. Is there some way that in this next role you'll be able to help roll the ball of humanity forward?
So what I'm going to say is so prosaic, but I'm going to tell you that money matters so much less than you think. That if you're graduating from the Harvard Business School, you're going to have enough to eat, and you'll be safe, and you'll have a great place, and you'll put your kids through school. And the thing I've noticed, I'm class of '85, so I go back every 5 years for the reunion. I promise you, money makes so much less difference than you think. There is no correlation among my classmates between how much money they made and how happy and engaged and at peace with themselves they are. And that's what people care about. When you go back to your 30th year reunion, you know, there are some very rich, very unhappy people. The people who are alive are those who tried something that really mattered to them. It's so striking.
I'll say actually, I want to put that into advice that I got from Professor Macomber when I was here, which is disproportionately value being happy.
That's a great line.
That's a
In
great
your spreadsheet, so in your spreadsheet, happiness is outweighing things.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much for your time today. For everyone in the room, climate is not something that is achieved in a day, in a year, or in a lifetime. So continue the conversation. There are a bunch of events both through the Energy and Environment Club, Social Enterprise, and of course upcoming Harvard Climate Week in April. So get involved, find ways to make an impact here in Boston/Cambridge and really in the world. So thank you again for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.
David, well done. Well done, sir. We'll be in touch about the climate stuff.
Yeah, it was just really pushing hard and trying to go into the point where